chapter 2, verses 22 to 26. What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days their work is grief and pain. Even at night their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too, I see, is from the hand of God, or without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, God gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. We have a reading from the New Testament, Matthew 22. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now we'll hear a contemporary word which comes from the novel The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. People like to do things. They like to do them well. A person likes to do what they are good at doing. After all, work is done for the work's sake. It is the lasting pleasure of life. There is no other reward on Anaris, no other law. One's own pleasure and the respect of one's fellows. A child free from the guilt of ownership and the burden of economic competition will grow up with the will to do what needs doing and the capacity for joy in doing it. It is useless work that darkens the heart. The delight of the nursing mother, of the scholar, of the successful hunter, of the good cook, of the skillful maker, of anyone doing needed work and doing it well. This durable joy is perhaps the deepest source of human affection and of sociality as a whole. Now we'll hear a word from Mike Weather.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here this morning to talk a little bit about work. And as you might imagine, when Carol asked me to speak, of course, as an academic, my mind immediately turned to academic things. The future of work, the nature of work, the automation of work, artificial intelligence and work. But I thought that might be a little dry. So what I wanted to do today is to talk about my experience of work and talk about the way in which work and work communities have shaped my life, but also how work and those work communities have shaped my idea of solidarity, and I hope to show shaped my ideas of what communion actually means. So, let me begin at the beginning. I'm going to show this through slides because I'm a very visual person and I assume you guys are too. So I'm going to show a few slides. I hope you can see them. I've tried to make them as big as I can, so I hope you can see. First of all, a little context. I come from Cardiff in South Wales. Cardiff is an old city, but primarily its prosperity in the 20th century, from about the late 1800s through the 20th century, was based on this. It had a shipyard. This is the basis of Cardiff's prosperity. And particularly, Cardiff was based on the export of coal, Welsh coal. Cardiff was the biggest coal exporting port in 1914 in the world.
You need to stay with the mic.
Oh, I need to stay with the mic. I can't. Oh, no. Don't worry. I'll stay. In 1914, 13 million tons of coal were exported through Cardiff. This is a picture of Cardiff in the late 1950s of the docks. I was born in October of 1957. In the background, you see the village of Penarth. That's where my father and my grandmother used to live. But the docks were important. Massive amounts of coal, massive amounts of steel that were brought from the steel works in Merthyr Tydfil, and over time, the development in Cardiff of its own steel works. The East Moors Works, a massive steel plant that when it closed in 1978, nearly 6,000 or 7,000 men were made redundant. So the entire economy of the city was based both on being longshoremen, dockers, or working in the steelworks. My grandfathers were dockers. My uncles were steel workers. My father, strangely, managed to get an apprenticeship and get a trade as a carpenter. So he went in a slightly different direction. But we all lived within the shadow of the steelworks. The East Moors Steelworks dominated the Adams Down Splot area of Cardiff where I was raised. Everyone around us worked either in the steelworks or the docks. All of us were at some point connected with the unions that represented us in disputes with management. There was an incredible sense of solidarity, a solidarity that connected us with each other. Now, this solidarity was tested during the wartime years. Some pictures of the neighborhood that I managed to find of the effects of the bombing. And actually, this is where my grandfather was killed. He was hit by a bomb, a beam fell on him, and 3 days later he died. My mother was 6. My grandmother had to raise 2 children on her own. She had also taken in one of the neighbor's sons whose parents had also been killed in the war. And my grandmother had the good sense to marry my step-grandfather, who was a London longshoreman who had been assigned to Cardiff and had been assigned to live with her. And it was a good, Pop was great to me. I mean, I remember, I could go on and on about the stories of my grandfather. He was a good man. But it's interesting, when I went to see my mother for her 90th birthday a few weeks ago, I asked her about her father, and she could tell me everything about him. She knew his name, she knew where he was from, she remembered. And I realized that the pain of his death at 6 years old, even though she is still 90, still lives with her. And the experience of wartime, the experience of the community, has shaped who and what she is. Now, this is where I used to live. This neighborhood is where I was raised. Not on this particular street, this is Swansea Street, but those endless terraced houses that you see in all of the good British working class programs, and, you know, when they want to contrast it with Downton Abbey, which is complete nonsense, but a good show, but complete nonsense historically. But you can see that people lived in this community in juxtaposition with the steelworks. It was an omnipresent reality. The smell, the smoke, the dirt. This is a pretty typical picture. This could have been my grandmother, because my grandmother used to do this. She'd get a bucket and she'd scrub the paving stones outside the house. There are some derelict houses you can see on the left-hand side. This picture, by the way, was taken in 1969 when I was 11. This, again, shows the contrast with the steelworks. Everyone in the community derived their income in some ways from this. But more than that, it shaped the nature of how people live. An insight from Marx, perhaps, that how we live shapes who we are, what our social consciousness actually is. This is a picture of the Splot Bingo Hall. If you see the street in the bottom right, my father and mother still live about 20 yards down there. This is a picture from a photograph from about 1968. This has been knocked down, new apartments have been made, but this was actually a center of community activity. Playing bingo during the week or at weekends brought the community together. And I remember as a kid that it was very much part of the community to join in things, to go places, to see things, to go to sporting events, to go to the miners' parades. My dad remembers going to the miners' parades to hear Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson, when I was a kid, was revered in Wales. And I've still got recordings of him singing the Welsh national anthem in Welsh. His radicalism was a natural affinity, particularly for the miners' union at that particular point. This is Abershon Street, where I used to hang out with some friends. I love the milk float. Some of you might remember that. I always remember the milkman delivering the milk in little milk glass bottles right on the street. And if in winter, when the milk had frozen, you'd have to leave it very carefully next to the fire. And my father and I used to fight for the cream that rose to the top of the bottle. And having that cream over your cereal in the morning was just phenomenal. This is 1969. This is the street next door to us. This is a street party for the investiture of the Prince of Wales in 1969. Prince Charles was invested as the Prince of Wales. Not that anyone was particularly monarchical. In fact, there's a strong Republican strain in the neighborhood, but any excuse for a street party was gratefully received. So we threw the bunting up, put tables across the ends of the street. Everyone brought a table to the middle of the street. Everyone made food, and we'd just walk around and dance and party and drink until the early hours of the morning. This is Clifton Street, the major shopping street near where I used to live. You can see the Price's confectionery store, great pastries, doesn't exist anymore. Shaw's, where my grandma used to send me to get yarn for her knitting. And just on the far left is where a couple of weeks ago I went to get my hair cut and took my 95-year-old father to the barber's. This is the street down the road. This is 1969. This is one of the more deprived streets in the area, deprived in a real sense. By this point in 1969, the docks was beginning to close and the steel works was beginning to phase out. Unemployment was beginning to increase. People were experiencing that in a very real and profound way. And it's interesting, even 20 or 30 years after I came to the United States, I would go home and I would see someone in the pub and they would come up to me, "Mike, how you doing? It's good to see you." And the question was always, are you working? Not where are you working, where are you, what are you doing? Are you working? Because what you were doing was irrelevant to the fact that you had a source of income. Now this picture is one of my all-time favorites. That cute, handsome baby is me. This is my grandmother. She was tough, as you can see. But she was amply chested, as we used to say. And when she hugged me, you stayed hugged. And I would give my left arm for one of those hugs. I can still feel it. She was great. This is my grandma with the neighborhood kids. She would round them up and take them to the beach, take them to Barry Island. Barry became famous for a show, and the name escapes me, Gavin and Stacey, a show that was based in Barry Island. But my grandmother is here, the one holding a baby in the front. That very pretty woman is my mom. And the one at the far left is my Aunt Carol. Patrick O'Flynn has his... I remember Patrick. He died in the steelworks when he was 17. He's got his arm around my grandma. When I showed this picture to my Aunt Carol and my mom, they could name everyone. And they knew what the people had done, where they were, how had they lived. Because that was important information about living in a community. This is the train station where we used to take the train to Barry. I can still hear my grandma's voice. Michael, don't go over the white line. Come here, you'll get killed by the train. You know, the admonition of grandma. This is the primary school where I went to school. This is Stacey Road Primary School, just round the corner, a very austere building. But again, teachers who were from the community, teachers who understood the pupils, understood the context in which we lived. This is the view of the steelworks from my high school. Even playing in the playground when I was in high school, you could smell the smoke from the steelworks. And if there was an accident and chemicals were spilled into the air, then school was off and we were gone. It was great. Happened quite a bit. This is Splott Park where we used to play. Jesse, you notice even play is shaped by industrial paraphernalia. This is an old train. We used to clamber all over it. There's an old truck and other machinery. We used to use these things to play on. And if you look very carefully at the photograph in the background, you'll see railway yards. We used to climb through the fence and play in the railway yards. The game was to run between shunting trucks and not get hit by them, which, as you can imagine, is dumb, stupid, and dangerous, but that's what we used to do as kids. This is Splott Road. It's still there. I took a walk down here a few weeks ago. This is 1969 during the fog. This is what happened to the docks in 1978. The steelworks closed. The docks began to close. Cardiff was hit with massive deindustrialization, a deindustrialization from which it has never recovered. A third of the people in old industrial areas still suffer from diseases associated with industrialization, particularly lung disease, high blood pressure, other things. Cardiff did not recover until the middle of the 1980s, early 1990s. The dockland was filled in. This is now how Cardiff looks. A freshwater lake, a marina, an opera house. It's beautiful. It's like what they did with Baltimore. But as something is gained, something is missed. And what's missed is that sense, I think, of solidarity. And I wanted to talk about that concept of solidarity a little bit today. The community that you see in the photographs is a community that experience agency. They experience dignity and meaning, even given the poverty and the conditions under which they found themselves. Now, in Catholic social teaching, John Paul II argued that solidarity is actually a virtue. It's about moral identification. It's about dignity, solidarity, what we call subsidiarity, cooperative action. Solidarity recognizes our interdependence. And at a time when there is a refusal to give to and a refusal to be nourished by the collective, that sense of solidarity is very important as a contrast to the rampant individualism that we tend to live under. Solidarity is different from communitarianism, where the community dominates the individual, as in some forms of populism and fascism. It's different from the common good. Who decides what the common good is going to be? And it's also different from empathy, particularly the kind of empathy that says, I know how you feel. But empathy is about real otherness. Empathy is about a time to listen and not take things for granted. The most empathetic response we can make is that I don't know. You have the time, the space, and freedom to tell me what I don't know about your experience. I don't have the right to colonize your experience as a variant of my own. Nor can I borrow or appropriate your experience. So that kind of empathy that involves listening as well as speaking is very critical. When we're in solidarity with people, we recognize each other more fully. We have a lot of listening and talking to do, but we emerge from a shared understanding of each other. It's an optimal form of human togetherness. And this is something that I learned from this sense of community that I was raised with. I learned how deeply we need one another. In times of crisis and trauma, we recognize sometimes that we don't have the resources. We need to be ourselves, to be human. We need other people to bring us into life. We need to know that we belong. We need to know that we're welcomed. We need to know that we're valued. And all of those things I was able to learn from the people around me, from the work experiences that they had had. So to be human is to exercise this sense of solidarity. And it's interesting that we're taught very often in Scripture about the fact that we're made in the image of God. And an image has always meant to me that the prototype, an image is always in relation to its prototype. To be in the image of God means that we are here because God is here. Always, always around us. And other human beings, because they are made in the image of God, demand our deepest attention and most consistent care. The sense of solidarity that I managed to get from this upbringing, this sense that I went stealing apples with some of my friends when I was 12. And we always used to go to the rich people's neighborhoods to get the apples. In Welsh, it's called where the crachach live. Crachach is the Welsh word for elites. And it sounds bad, and it is bad. The crachach. I still love that word. So I had a big bag of apples, and I was rushing home with the apples, and the bike came round the street, and I went straight into my father. And he stopped me, and he looked at the apples, and he said, "Where did you get those from?" And I thought, oh my God, no point lying to the old man, he'll find out. So I said, well, we got them from the trees of houses up in King Coed, which was the rich people's neighborhood. And immediately my father said to me, well, that's all right then. But if I find that you took them from Mrs. Jones in the next street, I will beat the living daylights out of you. Now get those apples home so your mother can make an apple tart for us later on. it was interesting, and I've often reflected on that story. For my father, a sense of morality was actually class-based. My father's sense of what was right and wrong was not a middle-class universal thing that you should never steal. For him, it depended very much on where things were coming from, what people's situations were, who you were in solidarity with, who you took care of. When the snows came, whose houses you would dig out first, which wasn't ours, usually Mrs. Shields, Mrs. Burton, Mrs. Taylor, Mrs. Mears, because their husbands had died. There was no one there. We had to dig them out to make sure they were okay. So this sense of solidarity as being a virtue, I think, is partly what we mean when we begin to talk about communion. At communion, we are always guests, but we're always, it seems to me, told through the act of communion that we're welcomed and that we're wanted. Everywhere in the New Testament, when we hear about Jesus, his sense of fellowship, to me, always speaks of a sense of solidarity. The giving and receiving of welcome, particularly in Jesus' person and in his utterances as we have from the Gospels, are always about that sense of welcome. When he asks the tax collector in Luke, "When are you going to invite me to your house?" It wasn't just an invitation to his, but it was a reciprocal thing. Jesus sought to remake communities, to build them in a new image, in a new way. And for that, there's a deep sense of solidarity. And the communion emphasizes, at least to me, that sense of solidarity. It's a place that we welcome people who are in deep need of our solidarity, in need of our fellowship, in need of our empathy. God calls us into being because he wants our company. And the message of the resurrection is that he wants that company to be eternal. And so I had a great time putting together these slides because they reminded me of that sense of solidarity that I learned. We didn't have two halfpennies to rub together, as we used to say, but we had people. We had solidarity. There were 12 members of my family living in the same street. My grandmother lived at number 30. My Aunt Carol lived at number 9. We had other relatives who lived in the same street. When I came home from school, when Mom was working, and all the women always worked, there was always someone to take care of us. Always someone looking out for us. The sense of solidarity extended also to the other areas of the neighborhood. I remember during the Thatcher years, my mother was the only one who was working. My dad, myself, and my brother were unemployed. And we were actually working, painting the outside of houses to get some money in the black economy. During the Thatcher years, Cardiff had unemployment rates of 26%. So we're in the unemployment line because we're drawing dole as well as working in the black market. And the line is around the street. And the line is going slowly. And there's a guy in front of us in overalls and carrying a toolbox, and he's getting more and more agitated at the slowness of the line. And eventually he can take it no longer. He throws the toolbox on the floor with an almighty crash. And at the top of his voice shouts out, "For God's sake, get a move on. Some of us have got work to do." And the rest of us stood, "Yeah, that's absolutely right. We've got work to do." But again, it was that sense that we're in the same boat. When my dad's workshop was robbed, it was broken into, everything was taken. He was a car sprayer, they took his spray guns, everything that, he had nothing. Within an hour, someone came by and said, John, well, what happened? Here's some cans of paint. Someone else came by with a spray gun. Someone else came by with sandpaper. By the end of the day, Dad had all kinds of things that he needed in order to keep going. And the best one was at the end of the day, someone came by who will always, I know the man's name, but he will always remain nameless. And he knocked the door and he said, John, I heard you've been robbed. That's bloody awful. I've got a generator for you. What? A generator? A bloody big electric generator for the spray gun. And my dad said, where did you get it? And he just looked at it, my dad, and he said, well, literally it fell off a truck. Let's get it inside as quick as we can before someone sees it. Within 48 hours, my dad was up and running and had a source of income again. But he relied on that sense of solidarity, that communion with each other. And so when we take bread and when we break bread together, I think it's well to remember that it's a symbol that we are wanted, that we're loved, that we are known. And I think that will do.